The world around us is rich with untold, fascinating stories from the past. Tales from people who shaped the world we know today. Adventurers, wartime heroes, and those who bled so we could live in freedom. And sometimes these stories are closer than we think. An old neighbor you greet every day might tell you one such. Citizens of Carrol County, Maryland, for example, lived next to a hero without knowing so. To them, he was just another guy who fought in World War II. They knew him only by his name, Joe Farinholt. But what they didn't know was that back in the day, everyone called him Lightning Joe, and he was more than just an ordinary soldier. He was one of the bravest Americans to fight the war, one of few to win no less than 4 Silver Star medals for gallantry in action. For decades, Joe Farinholt kept his story secret. He never bragged about his glorious past. He didn't care about fame. It was not why he fought in the war. Actually, he joined the ranks for a whole different reason. Joe was born on July 17, 1922 in Cantonsville, Maryland. He was the 7th of 11 children in the family of Frank and Mildred Farinholt. Although he grew up during the Great Depression, Joe always said he had a happy childhood. His family lived modestly, with Joe having to share a bed with his 6 brothers. Yet he never asked for much. At an early age, Joe quit school so he could work, so he could have his own bed, money for food and clothes, and help his family. At that time, young Joe didn't have much of a choice. One of the rare places where he could find all that was the Army, and that's why he decided to join the ranks. However, there was one problem. Joe was only 15 years old. In the 1930s, the minimum age to enlist in the United States Army was typically 18 years old. However, boys as young as 16 could enlist with parental consent. Nevertheless, Joe decided to try his luck. He boarded the train to Baltimore and went straight to the Army recruitment office. He decided to lie and tell the recruiter he was 16. Unfortunately, his youthful appearance gave him away. The recruiter told him to come back when he was 16 and had his parents' permission. Failure to join the Army was a huge disappointment for young Joe, but he didn't want to give up so easily. He desperately wanted to serve. If the Army didn't want him, then the National Guard might. Already the following day, he returned to Baltimore and went to see a National Guard recruiter. This time, he had a different strategy. As advised by his uncle, who told him if he had to lie, he should lie big time because people don't believe little lies, he told the recruiter he was 23, and it worked. Joe Farinholt was assigned to Company B, 5th Maryland Infantry Regiment. It was 1938 when Joe joined the National Guard. At the time, things had already started to heat up in Europe, but the war was still far from the United States. For Joe, this time was one of the best in his life. He only wanted to have fun and make some money along the way. It was during his stay in the Guard that Joe received the nickname Lightning. One story says the nickname was given to him by the company commander because it took Joe forever to get something done. Another reason why buddies called him so was because Joe was the best and fastest boxer in the regiment. Then, in 1940, things started getting serious. After the fall of France, it became obvious that the United States couldn't stay out of the war forever, even though the isolationist movement was still remarkably strong in the country. In October of that year, the company called for people to join active service. Joe volunteered and moved to the 5th Regiment Armory, helping the unit prepare for the war. It didn't take long before the entire 5th Maryland was mobilized. In February 1941, it was reorganized into the 175th Infantry Regiment, part of the 29th Infantry Division. As part of the reorganization, Joe was moved to the newly formed 3rd Battalion Headquarters Company Anti-Tank Platoon and promoted to corporal. The training took place at Fort Meade. Farinholt and his platoon were supposed to learn to handle a 37mm anti-tank gun, but had none. Resourcefulness and determined he was, Joe made a simulated gun out of an old axle, 2 tires, and a piece of metal as an armored plate. They trained with this toy gun until the platoon received the real stuff. Then came December 7th, 1941, and Joe was now certainly going to war. However, it wasn't until September 1942 that they set sail for Europe. The port of destination was Greenock, Scotland. It took 10 days for Joe Farinholt and the entire 29th Division to reach the British coast, only to taste the war on the very landing. As the division unloaded the ship, a couple of German bombers attacked the port. That day, Joe's division suffered the first casualty. From Greenock, the division moved across the island to Tidworth Barracks at Land's End in southwestern England. Tidworth was where Joe's unit spent most of their time. There, they received new 57mm anti-tank guns and did much of their training. As months passed, one American unit after another moved out of England. Some went to Africa, others to Italy, but the 29th Infantry Division remained. At some point, the unit started receiving visits from the High Army and government officials, including Winston Churchill, General Eisenhower, and General Montgomery. At that point, men began to realize they were being prepared for something big as landing in Europe. Joe Farinholt was among the first from his unit to land at Normandy. He was part of the battalion's reconnaissance party that landed on Omaha Beach on the night of June 6th. Because they arrived when night fell, Joe couldn't see the carnage that took place earlier that day. Only in the morning did he realize what his comrades went through as they assaulted the beach. The sight of scattered bodies infuriated him so deeply that he was driven by that rage until he returned home from the war. Already the following day, as soon as his 57mm guns arrived, Lightning Joe and his platoon jumped into action around the town of Isigny. There, Joe and his men took their first hit, a German truck that wandered into the area. In days and weeks that followed, there was more and more action as the Allied forces moved into the hedgerow country. In the hedgerows, Lightning Joe earned his first Silver Star. It was July 13, 1944, and Joe's platoon was fighting in the vicinity of St. Lo. During the firefight, Joe noticed a German mortar crew in the hedgerows. In hedgerow fighting, mortars were especially dangerous because they were pretty lethal but hard to spot. Lightning Joe took his favorite weapon, a bazooka, and knocked out the crew with one shot. Surprisingly, he then jumped over the bushes and started running toward their position. However, as he reached the dead German crew, he found out there was a German tank right behind the nearby hedgerow. It didn't scare him though. He simply reloaded his bazooka, aimed, and shot the tank right through its engine at the back. As the tank exploded, he ran as fast as he could back to where his platoon was. He jumped into the trench, landing on his backside. Lieutenant Dobson from his platoon, by what he just witnessed, told him, "My God, soldier, you will get a medal for that." Indeed, Corporal Joe Farinholt received a Silver Star medal for what he did that day, the first of 4. The citation claimed that with complete disregard for his own safety, he crossed open territory where he located and eliminated an enemy mortar and bazooka, permitting the advance of our tanks. The thing was, Lightning Joe did it for a whole different reason, with the last intention of getting a medal. He just wanted some souvenirs. That was why he ran over to the German position after he eliminated the crew. He hoped he could find a Luger pistol or a knife, a dagger, whatever. Unfortunately for him, he came back empty-handed. During the war, many soldiers felt immense pride if they earned one Silver Star medal. Lightning Joe won 2 in just 5 days. On July 18th, Lightning Joe and his crew lost their gun and truck to Germans as they were forced to retreat after a surprising German counterattack. Joe didn't easily come to terms with that loss. He liked that gun. Unwilling to let it go, he gathered a couple of volunteers, waited for nightfall, and crawled to German positions. Basically, they stole back the truck and the gun right from under the Germans' noses. Unfortunately, the following day, the gun and truck were captured again by the Germans. Once again, Joe and his men undertook a night action and managed to retake their possession. This time, however, they did it under a rain of German bullets. As hard as it is to believe, the same scenario repeated itself for the 3rd time 2 days later. Lightning Joe simply refused to let go of his gun. He was the type of guy who fought the war the way he found fit. He paid little attention to rules and even less to authorities. On one occasion, he met General Patton, whose column had been blocked by a German tank that Lightning Joe's crew had just destroyed. General Patton ordered him to move the tank, to which Joe responded, "I'm sorry, sir. My job is to knock him out, not to move him out." Initially shocked, Patton replied, "My God, man, that's the way to talk." By the end of July, the 29th Infantry Division with the rest of the Allied troops broke out of Normandy. They moved across France, Belgium, and Holland and into Germany. Over there, near the town of Gallantry, Joe earned his third Silver Star. It was October 13th, and Joe and his men were resting in the command post. Suddenly, their positions were shelled by the German artillery. The 1st Battalion received a direct hit. There were dead and wounded soldiers all over the place. Lightning Joe jumped out and rushed to their help. With shells still falling, they dragged the wounded soldiers to safety and helped medics treat them. Joe Farinholt always said he didn't deserve this award. It wasn't only him who saved the wounded soldiers. After all, they did what anyone else would have done in their position. In November 1944, the 29th Division pushed on into Germany. After his platoon commander got injured, Joe Farinholt took command of the unit and was promoted to tech sergeant. With each mile into enemy territory, the fighting was getting worse. Particularly severe was the fighting for the town of Borheim. Joe's 175th Regiment had to take it house by house. Even when they took it, they had to defend it vigorously against the Germans who counterattacked on a daily basis. Since they always attacked with tanks, Joe's men were constantly repelling them. On November 26, the Germans tried to enter the town via the road leading from the northeast. The road was watched by Joe's platoon, who prepared them a welcome party. Leading the German column was a Tiger tank. As it approached the platoon's position, one of the guns opened fire but missed. The Tiger responded with a round that killed the American gunner. Seeing what just happened, Lightning Joe ran toward the gun to take the gunner's position. He loaded the armor-piercing round, aimed, and hit the Tiger in the rear tread and engine compartment. It was a great hit that immobilized the Tiger and created a roadblock for the rest of the German tanks. Unfortunately, the Tiger was far from incapacitated. Its machine gunner opened fire at Joe and hit 26 times. Joe got wounded in his back and thighs, but his right lower leg was shattered to pieces. He was bleeding heavily, but still alive. Desperate to get out of the place, Joe started crawling to the safety of his command post. He needed to get to his Jeep and drive to battalion headquarters to let them know the Germans were coming. Somehow, Joe got himself into the vehicle and drove towards the HQ. While driving, he realized his right shin bone was hanging by a skin. He couldn't press the brakes, so he simply crashed into the house where the headquarters was located. Several men jumped out and took him out of the Jeep. Joe allowed them to take him to the medic only after he reported to his commanding officer. Lightning Joe was so badly wounded that a priest gave him his last rites. However, the surgeon did a marvelous job and saved his life. For his bravery in defending the town of Borheim, Tech Sergeant Joe Farinholt was awarded his 4th Silver Star. At the same time, the war was over for him. He was moved to a hospital in London, where he had several surgeries and spent the following 2 years learning how to walk again. Joe's shin wounds were so severe that the doctors couldn't close them completely. For the rest of his life, Joe had to bandage them twice a day, every day. However, something good came out of his stay at the hospital. One day, he got a visit from a girl who had sent him letters during the war. A young, pretty redhead called Agnes. It was a love at first sight. While he was still at the hospital, Joe and Agnes got married. They returned to the States in late 1946, by which time the victory fever had already faded. Joe never received the grand welcome that most war heroes did, nor did he ask for it. He chose instead to live a quiet, peaceful life with Agnes, raising their 4 children. He was proud to have served alongside some of the finest men in the U.S. Army. Lightning Joe Farinholt was certainly one of them.